Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get right into the heart of fascinating topics, pulling out those essential insights, really helping you get well informed. Today we're doing a deep dive into some, well, pretty profound source material. It all focuses on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And our mission, like always, is to dig into the sources you've shared and pull out the key nuggets of knowledge. Now, these sources, they start with a really bold claim. They say Christianity is not blind faith. In fact, it is the only religion based on objective evidence. That's quite a statement. They frame the resurrection not just as, a great story, but as the greatest news of all. So the big question is, how could an event like that, something so seemingly improbable, leave such, well, undeniable traces on history and people's lives? That's really what we're tackling today. We're going to explore seven compelling points, seven pieces of evidence our sources lay out. We're going to start with the first one, the actual accounts themselves. Our sources highlight that the resurrection was recorded by four independent authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you might think, hang on, if the stories are different, doesn't that weaken the case? But our sources actually argue the opposite.
That's exactly right. It's fascinating how they approach this. The sources really emphasize that these accounts, they agree on the core substance, but they differ in the details. And the point they make is that this is what you'd expect from, truthful testimony, different people remembering real events from their own perspectives. It's not like a perfectly synchronized, fabricated story where everyone's got the exact same lines down pat.
Right. Like if you were making it up, you'd probably try to make it all match perfectly.
Exactly. Real life isn't that neat. These differences, these little wrinkles, they actually add a layer of authenticity almost accidentally.
Okay, so when we talk about that core agreement, the substance, what are some of the key events the sources point to that show up consistently across these different accounts?
Well, the sources list several significant events that have this harmony. For instance, Mary Magdalene and the other women, they're consistently reported as the first ones to see the risen Christ. Then you have Peter running to the tomb after hearing from the women and finding the burial cloths there. That's in John and Luke. There's also the story of Jesus appearing to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And crucially, Jesus revealing himself to the main group of disciples, the 11, suddenly appearing right there among them. These core things, they're repeated.
Okay. And then the flip side, those differing details, how exactly do the sources use those to kind of bolster the claim of authenticity?
Right. So the sources are quite clear. These aren't contradictions, they're different perspectives. They actually see them as more evidence for authenticity. Like John gives a really detailed account of Jesus talking with Mary Magdalene one-on-one. But Matthew and Luke, they focus more on the whole group of women.
Different focus.
Exactly. And Mark talks about the women seeing an angel and being, initially too scared to say anything. Matthew's the only one who tells us what happened with the guards at the tomb when the angel showed up, how they reacted, the cover-up story later.
Oh, the guards, right.
Yeah. And John adds that detail about the room being locked when Jesus appeared to the disciples. It just underscores the miraculous nature of it. It really feels like you're getting reports from different people who saw slightly different things or focused on different aspects.
That makes sense.
And it's worth remembering, Matthew, Mark, and John, they were eyewitnesses. Luke, well, he carefully interviewed eyewitnesses to compile his account. So you get both direct observation and careful reporting.
Okay, moving to the next point. This one's about the sheer number of people involved. It wasn't just a couple of disciples. Our sources say Christ appeared to all sorts of different people, different groups, even including one group of over 500 people at once. That's a lot.
It's a massive number. And it's a really pivotal point in the sources. They strongly emphasize that Jesus appeared physically in his body. He wasn't some kind of, spirit or ghostly apparition. He was presented as a living, breathing man.
So not just a fleeting glimpse.
No, not at all. When you have hundreds of people seeing someone, talking to him, touching him, even eating with him, that points very strongly to a tangible physical presence. The sources actually lay out 12 recorded appearances that give us a real sense of this.
Could you give us a couple of the most maybe compelling examples from that list, ones that really show that physical nature and how people reacted?
Absolutely. Take Mary Magdalene again. She recognized Jesus. She actually held onto him. She could see him, hear him, touch him. The other women, same thing. They grabbed his feet, worshipped him. Very physical interaction. Then there's Cleopas and his friend on the road to Emmaus. They walked and talked with him for ages, didn't even recognize him at first. Only when he broke bread did they realize. And he gave them this whole Bible lesson. They could see and hear him, and the sources suggest he might have eaten with them too.
Right, the Emmaus Road story.
Then the 10 disciples in that locked room. At first, they're startled, scared even. then overjoyed, and Jesus specifically shows them his wounds, his hands and side, and he eats fish with them to prove he's not a ghost.
Eating seems to be a recurring theme.
It really does. And then Thomas, of course, famously doubting, he says he won't believe unless he can physically touch the wounds. And Jesus invites him to do just that. Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side.
Wow.
Later, 7 disciples are fishing, don't recognize him on the shore until this miraculous catch of fish happens. Then they rush ashore, and Jesus has breakfast cooking for them, bread and fish. He gives it to them, again, likely eats with them.
And the 500.
Paul mentions that appearance to over 500 brothers at the same time, and he explicitly says most of them were still alive when he was writing. It's like he's saying, go check, ask them yourself. It's presented as living testimony.
That's incredible.
Even the final appearance, the ascension, the apostles see him, hear him, and Luke mentions he ate with them then too. It's consistently physical.
What's really intriguing, though, is that our sources even bring in Jesus' enemies. They talk about this effort to, well, deceive the public. How the chief priests and elders cooked up this plan, paid the soldiers a large sum of money to spread a specific story.
Yeah, the story was his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep.
So how does that fit into the evidence? Seems counterintuitive.
Well, if you connect the dots, the sources present this cover-up story as a kind of backhanded admission. It implicitly confirms that the body was actually gone. Why bribe soldiers to say the body was stolen if it was still sitting right there in the tomb?
Good point. You wouldn't need a cover story.
Exactly. So it adds this unexpected layer. The enemy's own actions suggest something extraordinary really did happen to the body in the tomb. Okay, moving on. Another really interesting angle the sources bring up is what they call inconvenient truths. These are details within the resurrection stories that you probably wouldn't include if you were just making the whole thing up. They almost seem to work against making the story seem polished or easily believable.
Right, these are the bits that make you pause. It's like, why would they put that in there if they were trying to convince everyone? What are some examples?
Exactly. Well, for starters, the very first witnesses were women, Mary Magdalene, and the others. In that first century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony wasn't considered legally valid, certainly not as strong as a man's.
So choosing them as the first witnesses seems odd, strategically.
Very odd if your goal was fabrication. Yet the accounts are clear. Christ appeared to them first. If you were inventing it, you'd likely pick, Peter or John or someone with more social standing.
Okay, what else?
Secondly, the disciples themselves. They are often shown as, kind of slow, sometimes foolish, even cowardly. Jesus actually rebukes them after the resurrection for being slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken.
So paint them in the best light.
Not at all. The sources point out how they kept misunderstanding things, arguing amongst themselves, Peter denying Jesus, all of them scattering at the crucifixion. It's quite raw, and maybe the biggest one. The disciples initially refused to believe the reports that Jesus was alive. They didn't believe the women when they came back from the tomb. Then, later, they didn't believe the 2 disciples who rushed back from Emmaus, saying they'd seen him. Mark explicitly says Jesus rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart.
Yeah, and Thomas, too.
And Thomas, the famous example. He flat out says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.
These aren't details you'd invent to make your key followers look good or make the story easy to swallow.
Precisely. The sources argue this points to a real commitment to telling it like it happened, warts and all, even when it made the story less convenient or the main characters seem flawed. It suggests authenticity over crafting a perfect narrative.
Let's shift gears a bit now to something more ancient prophecies. The idea that the resurrection wasn't just a random event, but actually fulfilled predictions made centuries earlier. Our sources mention Jesus himself often pointed the disciples back to the scriptures about this.
Yes, that's a really crucial element in the source's argument. Now, sometimes people hear prophecy and think it must be vague, easily twisted after the fact. So the question becomes, just how specific were these prophecies, and what do they really say about the resurrection? The sources give some pretty compelling specific examples.
Okay, like what? Where do they start?
They go way back, even to Genesis 3.15, the first hint of the gospel. God tells the serpent, Satan, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
And the interpretation.
The sources explain this as Jesus, the offspring of the woman being wounded, bruised on the heel by Satan through the crucifixion. But ultimately, Jesus triumphs, bruising Satan's head through his resurrection and victory over death and sin.
Interesting. What about later prophecies?
Well, Isaiah 53 is a huge one. It's this incredibly detailed picture of the suffering servant. It describes his rejection, his suffering for others' sins, his innocence. He had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth.
That part's often connected to the crucifixion.
It is. But the key part for this point comes at the end. After all that suffering, Isaiah says, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and he will see the light of life and be satisfied. The sources argue, how can he prolong his days and see the light of life after being killed unless he rises again? The reward for his suffering requires his resurrection.
So the prophecy includes not just the suffering, but the victory after.
Exactly. Then you've got Psalm 16. David writes prophetically, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption, meaning decay in the grave. And the sources make a point of noting how Peter, on the day of Pentecost, quotes this very psalm and applies it directly to Jesus, saying David did see decay, but Jesus, whom God raised up, did not.
So Peter used it as resurrection proof right from the start.
Right at the beginning, yeah. And Psalm 22 is another powerful example. It starts with the famous words Jesus cried from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It goes on to describe the mocking, the casting lots for his clothes, details fulfilled at the crucifixion.
Yes, very specific details.
But then the second half of the psalm completely shifts tone. It speaks of victory, of proclaiming God's name, of future generations worshiping, of God's rule. The sources argue this trajectory from agony to eternal reign mirrors Christ's death and resurrection. So it's not just isolated phrases, but this whole arc woven into these ancient texts.
And his next point feels very human. It deals with family, specifically Jesus' own family. Our sources point out they weren't initially his biggest fans. In fact, at one point they thought he was out of his mind and tried to take him away. John's gospel even says point blank, even his own brothers did not believe in him. They seemed kind of embarrassed, maybe contemptuous.
Yeah, it's quite a stark picture of their initial skepticism, which makes the transformation of his half-brother James so incredibly striking. This is what's so fascinating. James grew up with Jesus, lived with him his whole life, and he was a skeptic.
You'd think knowing someone that well would make it harder, maybe, to see them as divine.
Perhaps. But the sources tell us that after Jesus died, rose again, and ascended suddenly, we see James right there in Jerusalem praying with the disciples and Mary.
So what changed for him?
The sources suggest it was the combination of Jesus' absolutely righteous life, the undeniable miracles he performed, and then, decisively, the resurrection. It's even mentioned, Paul points this out in 1 Corinthians, that Jesus made a specific post-resurrection appearance just to James.
Personal appearance.
Yes. And the result, this former skeptic, his own brother, becomes a pillar of the early church. He later writes the Epistle of James, introducing himself as a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Wow.
As the source says, that's quite the turnaround. What else could possibly explain such a fundamental shift in someone who knew Jesus so intimately, other than being utterly convinced by the resurrection?
That leads really well into the next point, the transformation of the other disciples, his closest followers. Our sources paint this picture. One minute they're terrified, running away, hiding after the crucifixion. Literally days later, they're bold, courageous, willing to face death for believing Jesus is the Messiah. And the sources emphasize, look, they had absolutely nothing to gain by making this up. In fact, they had everything to lose: their comfort, their safety, their lives.
That transformation is, well, it's arguably one of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented. If we think about it, the sources highlight that at the cross, their hopes were completely shattered. They had expected a political messiah, someone to overthrow Rome, maybe.
Right, they had the wrong idea.
Totally. So the crucifixion wasn't just sad, it was the end of their dream. They scattered. But then Jesus appears, and he doesn't just show up. He explains things, corrects their misunderstandings, shows them how the scriptures pointed to all this, as Luke records. And this encounter, this realization that he was alive and truly was the Messiah foretold, it just fundamentally changed them.
How is that change described?
The sources talk about this profound shift from fear to, well, incredible courage, from pain and grief to spiritual power, from hopelessness to this unshakable eternal hope, from depression and confusion to having this clear driving mission. Again, there was no earthly reward for this, only persecution, suffering, and likely death.
Are there specific examples given of this change in action?
Oh, absolutely. Think about those two disciples on the road to Emmaus again. The moment they recognized Jesus, what did they do? They immediately got up, turned around, and walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem in the dark, likely dangerous, just to tell the others. Exhaustion didn't matter. Urgency took over.
That's dedication.
And then look at the apostles later in the book of Acts. They get arrested, thrown in prison, interrogated by the authorities, threatened, even flogged. And their reaction. Acts says they left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name.
Rejoicing after being flogged?
It's extraordinary. And it says they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah, both in the temple courts and from house to house. The sources conclude that this kind of radical, life-altering change, a change that led almost all of them to die as martyrs, really can only be explained if they genuinely believed, based on undeniable personal experience, that Jesus was truly risen.
Okay, that brings us to the final point, which is maybe the broadest, most sweeping claim. The idea that Jesus' life didn't just impact individuals, but had such a profound effect that it literally split history in two. And the sources point directly to our calendar system, BC and AD before Christ, and Anno Domini Latin for in the year of our Lord.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the assertion the sources make. They say, look, there were other ways of counting years, other calendars used in different places and times, but no other measurement had the prominence, power, and significance that the life of Jesus had. Think about the global impact of that. Regardless of culture or belief, for centuries, the entire world largely oriented its dating system around this one life.
And the sources even tackle the modern shift, towards using BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. They argue that even changing the letters doesn't change the reality. The dividing line, the reference point, is still the life of Jesus. You can call it Common Era, but why does the era become common at that specific point?
Exactly. The pivot point remains. It's an undeniable historical footprint. And the sources kind of bring it back to a personal level, too, concluding that Jesus is not only the turning point for all time, he is even the turning point for every single soul who will receive him.
Right.
Because, as Jesus himself claimed, I am the resurrection and the life, it connects the grand historical impact back to the core claim about who he is.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's quite a range of evidence. We've looked at those independent accounts, how their harmonies and differences are seen as authenticating, the huge number of eyewitnesses, the variety of people he appeared to, emphasizing his physical presence. Those inconvenient truths, details that seem counterproductive if you were making it up, the fulfillment of really specific ancient prophecies, the conversion of a close family skeptic, James, the radical life-changing transformation of the disciples from fearful to fearless, and finally, the sheer undeniable impact on how we even measure history. It's quite comprehensive when you lay it all out.
It really is, and perhaps it leaves you, the listener, with an important question to mull over. When you consider this depth, this variety of evidence, I mean, from intensely personal transformations right up to the structure of our global calendar, what does it mean for you? Especially when these claims, as the sources insist, are presented not as blind faith, but as something rooted in objective, verifiable evidence. It's certainly something to think about.
Definitely a compelling thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into some truly fascinating source material today. We really hope you'll keep exploring the topics that capture your interest, and we look forward to the next time we get to unpack some compelling sources together right here.